On the night of our 5th wedding anniversary, my father-in-law stood up in front of 50 guests, pointed directly at me, and said, "The biggest mistake my son ever made was marrying a woman who brought nothing to this family." The room went completely silent. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died instantly. Even the waiters seemed frozen. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. Surely no one would humiliate their daughter-in-law like that in front of friends, relatives, business associates, and complete strangers. But then I looked around the room and realized everyone had heard exactly what I had heard. My father-in-law, Harold Whitmore, stood confidently at the center of the banquet hall, holding a glass of champagne while dozens of people stared at me. Some looked shocked. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked away because they didn't want to witness what was happening. I slowly turned toward my husband Daniel, expecting him to immediately shut his father down. Instead, he lowered his eyes and said nothing. That silence hurt more than Harold's words ever could. 5 years earlier, I had married Daniel because I believed he was different from the rest of his family. When we first met, he was ambitious, kind, and independent. He spoke openly about building his own future instead of relying on family money. Back then, his parents barely paid attention to me. I was just another girlfriend they assumed wouldn't last. But after our relationship became serious, their attitude changed. Suddenly, everything about me became a problem. The neighborhood where I grew up wasn't good enough. The college I attended wasn't prestigious enough. The career I built wasn't impressive enough. No matter what I accomplished, they always found a way to make it seem insignificant. I spent years convincing myself that if I worked harder, smiled more, and proved my loyalty, they would eventually accept me. Instead, every effort only seemed to give them another opportunity to remind me that I wasn't one of them. The anniversary dinner had been Harold's idea from the beginning. He insisted on organizing the event himself. At first, I thought he was finally making an effort to improve our relationship. Looking back, I realize how naive that was. The banquet hall was one of the most expensive venues in the city. Crystal chandeliers hung above elegantly decorated tables. Soft piano music played in the background while guests enjoyed expensive wine and gourmet meals. Everything looked perfect. It was the kind of celebration people posted on social media to make their lives seem flawless. But underneath all the luxury, something felt wrong from the moment we arrived. Throughout the evening, Harold and my mother-in-law exchanged strange looks. Several times I noticed them whispering to relatives while glancing in my direction. Even Daniel seemed unusually nervous. Every time I asked if something was wrong, he forced a smile and said everything was fine. Halfway through dinner, Harold tapped his glass with a spoon and stood up to make a speech. At first, everyone assumed he wanted to congratulate us. He spent several minutes praising Daniel's business success, talking about company growth, investments, and future expansion plans. Then the tone changed, slowly, deliberately. His eyes settled on me and a cold smile appeared on his face. "Success," he said, "depends heavily on the people you surround yourself with." A few guests nodded politely. Some people help you grow, some people hold you back. The room became noticeably quieter. My stomach tightened. Something about the way he was looking at me made it impossible to ignore where this was heading. Then he laughed softly and said, "Unfortunately, not every marriage is an equal partnership." Several guests exchanged confused looks. I felt my pulse quicken. Harold continued speaking as though he were delivering a business presentation instead of publicly humiliating me. He questioned my career. He minimized my accomplishments. He implied that Daniel had achieved success entirely on his own while carrying the burden of supporting me. Every sentence felt carefully rehearsed. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This wasn't someone speaking without thinking. Every insult had been planned in advance. What shocked me most wasn't Harold's cruelty. It was Daniel's silence. He sat beside me staring at the tablecloth while his father dismantled my dignity piece by piece in front of everyone we knew. Then came the final blow. Harold raised his glass and smiled. Let's be honest, my son could have married anyone. Instead, he chose a woman who brought absolutely nothing to this family. A few nervous laughs echoed through the room, someone coughed, someone else looked away. I felt every pair of eyes in the hall focused on me. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then my mother-in-law leaned back in her chair and smirked. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't just Harold, they all knew. This entire evening had been planned. The anniversary dinner wasn't a celebration, it was an ambush. Slowly I stood from my chair. The room became even quieter. Harold looked pleased with himself. He expected tears. He expected me to run away embarrassed. He expected me to break. Instead, I picked up my purse and calmly looked around the room. 50 people watched me. Some looked guilty. Some looked curious. Some looked relieved that they weren't the target. Then I turned toward Daniel one last time. Deep down, I was still hoping he would finally stand up and say something. Anything. An apology. A defense. A simple stop. But he remained silent. That silence answered every question I had been asking myself for the past 5 years. Without saying another word, I walked toward the exit. Then I stopped. Slowly, I pulled my phone from my purse. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from disappointment. There was only one person I wanted to call, one person whose name Daniel's family had never cared enough to ask about, one person I hadn't spoken to in several months. The call connected after the second ring. "Grandpa," I said quietly. The moment those words left my mouth, something shifted because none of the people in that room had any idea who my grandfather really was. The moment I said, "Grandpa," the room seemed to hold its breath. Harold's smug expression didn't disappear, but I noticed a flicker of confusion cross his face. He clearly assumed I was calling someone for emotional support. Maybe he thought I was about to cry to a relative about how unfairly I had been treated. None of them understood why I had made that call. None of them realized that for 5 years, I had deliberately avoided talking about my family history. I never believed people should be judged by the success of their relatives. I wanted to build my own life, earn my own respect, and be valued for who I was rather than whose name I carried. Unfortunately, the Whitmore family had spent years judging me without ever bothering to learn who I actually was. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" my grandfather asked calmly. Even through the phone, his voice carried the same steady confidence I had known since childhood. For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. I looked around the room filled with people who had just watched me be humiliated in public while the one person who should have defended me sat silently in his chair. "No," I replied honestly. "I'm not okay." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Tell me what happened," he said. I glanced toward Harold, who was still standing with his champagne glass, looking increasingly irritated that I wasn't reacting the way he expected. "I think I'd rather show you," I said quietly. "Can you come?" Another short silence followed. "Send me the address," Grandpa replied. "I'll be there soon." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my purse. Harold let out a sarcastic laugh. "Calling your grandfather isn't going to change anything," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. A few nervous chuckles echoed through the room. Normally, comments like that would have hurt me. Tonight they didn't. For the first time in years, something inside me felt strangely calm. Maybe it was because I had finally stopped trying to earn their approval. Maybe it was because Daniel's silence had forced me to accept a truth I had been avoiding for years. Whatever the reason, I no longer felt the need to defend myself. I simply returned to my seat and waited. The next 30 minutes were some of the longest of my life. Conversation slowly resumed around the room, but the atmosphere had changed completely. People whispered behind their hands. Some guests avoided eye contact with me altogether. Others looked at me with sympathy. Harold continued acting as though nothing unusual had happened. He laughed with business associates, made jokes, and ordered another bottle of wine. My mother-in-law behaved the same way. Every now and then she glanced toward me with a satisfied expression, as though she believed the evening had gone exactly according to plan. Daniel remained silent beside me. He tried speaking twice, but each time I ignored him. I wasn't interested in excuses anymore. Finally, about 35 minutes later, the banquet hall doors opened. At first, nobody paid much attention. Most guests assumed another late arrival had entered the party. Then the room gradually began growing quieter. One conversation stopped, then another. Heads started turning toward the entrance. Even Harold paused mid-sentence. I followed everyone's gaze and immediately recognized my grandfather. Despite being in his 70s, he still carried himself with remarkable confidence. His silver hair was neatly combed, his posture perfectly straight, and his expression unreadable. He wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits walked beside him. Behind them were several more individuals who looked familiar, though I couldn't immediately place where I had seen them before. Grandpa's eyes found me instantly. He ignored everyone else in the room and walked directly toward my table. "Emma," he said softly when he reached me, "are you all right?" That simple question nearly broke me. Not because I wanted to cry, but because it was the first time all evening anyone had bothered asking how I felt. I nodded slowly. "I'll be okay." Grandpa studied my face for a moment before turning his attention toward Harold. "Would you be the man who publicly humiliated my granddaughter?" The room went completely silent. Harold straightened in his chair. "And you are?" Grandpa looked at him calmly. "My name is Arthur Sterling." The reaction was immediate. A wine glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the floor. One of the business guests suddenly went pale. Another man actually stood up from his chair. For the first time all evening, confusion appeared on Harold's face. He clearly recognized the name, but he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Arthur Sterling wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was one of the most respected real estate developers in the country. His company owned properties across multiple states. Entire business districts carried the Sterling name. Universities, hospitals, and charitable foundations had received millions in donations from his organization. The man Harold had spent years mocking without ever meeting was standing directly in front of him. "That's impossible," Harold said quietly. Grandpa smiled. "Is it?" I watched realization slowly spread across the room. Guests began whispering again, but this time for a very different reason. Several people pulled out phones, others exchanged shocked looks. Daniel looked as though all the air had left his body. My mother-in-law stared at me with wide eyes, trying to process information she clearly never expected to learn. Harold swallowed hard. You're Arthur Sterling? Yes. The single word seemed to hit him harder than any insult ever could. For years, Harold had treated me like someone beneath his family. He had mocked my background without knowing anything about it. He had assumed that because I never talked about wealth, influence, or status, I had none. Now the foundation of every assumption he had made was collapsing in front of 50 witnesses. Grandpa looked around the room before speaking again. "What's most disappointing," he said calmly, "isn't the disrespect shown toward my granddaughter. It's the fact that none of you bothered learning who she is before deciding what she was worth. Nobody had an answer for that, not Harold, not my mother-in-law, and certainly not Daniel, because deep down they all knew he was right." The silence that followed my grandfather's words felt heavier than anything Harold had said all evening. For years, my in-laws had built an entire narrative about who I was. In their minds, I was the ordinary woman who had somehow managed to marry into a more successful family. They had convinced themselves that I needed them, that I should be grateful for their acceptance, and that my place in their world depended entirely on Daniel. Now, in a matter of seconds, that illusion was crumbling. I watched Harold's face carefully. The confidence that had fueled his speech earlier was gone. In its place was uncertainty, worse than uncertainty, fear, not because of my grandfather's wealth, but because he suddenly realized that he had publicly humiliated someone without understanding the consequences. Several of the business associates sitting nearby were staring at Grandpa with obvious recognition. A few had already approached him respectfully, introducing themselves and shaking his hand. The same people who had laughed nervously during Harold's speech now looked as though they wanted to disappear. Harold tried to recover. He forced a laugh and straightened his jacket. "Well, this is certainly a surprise," he said. "Emma never mentioned any of this." Grandpa's expression didn't change. "She never mentioned it because she wasn't raised to use family connections as a weapon," he replied calmly. "She wanted people to respect her for who she was, not because of who her grandfather happened to be." His words landed directly where they needed to. Several guests lowered their eyes. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. For the first time all evening, he looked ashamed. Unfortunately, shame arriving 5 years late didn't impress me. I had spent years defending him, explaining away his silence, convincing myself that he would eventually stand up for me. Tonight proved otherwise. When it mattered most, he had chosen comfort over courage. One of Harold's business partners suddenly approached our table. The man looked nervous. "Mr. Sterling," he said respectfully, "it's an honor to finally meet you." Grandpa nodded politely. I noticed Harold watching the interaction with growing concern. The reason quickly became obvious. The man wasn't just a business associate, he was one of the investors Harold had been desperately trying to impress for months. Before tonight, Harold had probably imagined himself as the most important person in the room. Now the attention had shifted entirely. Conversations throughout the banquet hall revolved around my grandfather. People who had barely acknowledged me all evening were suddenly treating me differently. I hated it, not because I wanted their approval, but because it confirmed exactly what Grandpa had been saying. Their respect wasn't genuine, it was conditional. They hadn't changed their opinion of me because they knew me better. They had changed because they finally understood who I was connected to. My mother-in-law attempted to salvage the situation next. "Emma, sweetheart," she said with a smile so fake it was almost painful to watch, "you should have told us." I stared at her in disbelief. Moments earlier, she had been enjoying my humiliation. Now she was speaking as though we were close family members. "Told you what?" I asked calmly. "That my grandfather is wealthy? Would that have changed the way you treated me?" Her smile disappeared immediately. She had no answer. Because we both knew the truth. It absolutely would have changed everything. They wouldn't have mocked my background. They wouldn't have questioned my value. They wouldn't have spent years making me feel like an outsider. Their behavior had never been about who I was. It had been about who they thought I was. Then something happened that surprised everyone. Daniel finally stood up. The room immediately became quiet again. For a moment, I wondered if he was about to defend me. Maybe guilt had finally pushed him to do the right thing. Maybe seeing his parents exposed had forced him to confront reality. But when he spoke, his words only confirmed how little he understood. "Emma," he said softly, "can we please talk privately?" I almost laughed. Private conversations were for misunderstandings. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was 5 years of disrespect, 5 years of excuses, 5 years of watching me suffer while he did nothing. "No," I replied. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss." His face fell. For the first time, he seemed to realize how serious this was. Not because his father had embarrassed me, not because his mother had insulted me, but because he was finally facing consequences for remaining silent. Grandpa watched the exchange quietly before placing a hand on my shoulder. "Emma," he said gently, "the choice is yours. Whatever happens next, nobody here gets to decide your worth except you." Those words hit me harder than anything else that night. For years, I had allowed other people to define my value. I had worked endlessly to earn acceptance from people who had no intention of giving it. I had tolerated behavior that I never should have accepted. Somewhere along the way, I had started measuring myself through their eyes. Standing there beside my grandfather, I suddenly realized how exhausting that had been. I wasn't broken. I wasn't inadequate. I wasn't the person Harold described in his speech. The problem had never been me. Harold made one final attempt to regain control. "Let's not be dramatic," he said. "This is still a family matter." Grandpa turned toward him slowly. "No," he replied. "A family matter would have been discussing concerns privately. What you did was public humiliation." Harold opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out, because for once nobody was listening to him. Not the guests, not the investors, not even his own son. The power he enjoyed wielding over people had vanished, and deep down he knew it. I looked around the banquet hall one final time. Earlier that evening I had felt trapped in that room. Now I felt something entirely different. Freedom. The people staring back at me weren't important anymore. Their approval wasn't important. Their opinions weren't important. The only thing that mattered was what I chose to do next. And for the first time in years, I knew exactly what that would be. As I stood in the center of that banquet hall, surrounded by 50 guests who had spent the last hour witnessing the collapse of my marriage, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, peace. For so long, I had been fighting a battle that was impossible to win. Every holiday, every family dinner, every gathering had turned into another test I was expected to pass. No matter how much effort I made, no matter how much kindness I showed, no matter how many insults I ignored, it was never enough. Harold and his wife had already decided who I was long before they ever took the time to know me. The painful truth was that nothing I could have done would have changed their minds, because their judgment had never been based on reality. It had been based on arrogance. And standing there that night, watching their carefully constructed image of superiority crumble in front of everyone they wanted to impress, I finally understood that their approval had never been worth chasing. Daniel looked completely lost. The confident businessman I had married seemed to have vanished. He stood frozen beside his chair, unable to look directly at me. His entire world had shifted in less than an hour. For years, he had convinced himself that staying silent was the easiest solution. Whenever his parents insulted me, he told himself they didn't mean it. Whenever they excluded me, he told himself it wasn't worth causing an argument. Whenever I cried after family gatherings, he promised things would eventually improve. The problem was that silence always benefits the person causing harm. His refusal to choose a side had ultimately become a choice itself. Tonight, he was finally seeing the result of that decision. Slowly, he walked toward me. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "Emma, please don't leave like this." I stared at him for several seconds. 5 years of memories flashed through my mind. The first apartment we shared, the vacations we took, the plans we made, the future I thought we were building together. Then I remembered every family dinner where I sat silently while his parents insulted me. Every holiday where I felt like an outsider. Every time he asked me to be patient instead of asking them to be respectful. "How else should I leave?" I asked quietly. Daniel opened his mouth but couldn't answer. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion appeared on his face. "I love you," he said. "Then you should have acted like it," I replied. The words weren't spoken with anger. That was what seemed to hurt him most. There was no yelling, no dramatic confrontation, just the simple truth. Love without protection, love without respect, love without action eventually becomes meaningless. Daniel lowered his head. Deep down, I think he finally understood that the issue was much bigger than one speech. Harold's humiliation had been public, but the damage had been building for years. Harold attempted one final time to regain control of the situation. He stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Emma, perhaps we can discuss this privately and move past the misunderstanding." Several guests actually looked embarrassed for him. Even they seemed to realize how absurd his words sounded. Grandpa looked at him calmly. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. "You publicly humiliated my granddaughter in front of 50 people." Harold shifted uncomfortably. "I was simply expressing concern." Grandpa smiled slightly. It wasn't a friendly smile. "No. Concern sounds very different. What you expressed was cruelty." Nobody argued with him. Not because of his wealth, not because of his influence, but because everyone in that room knew he was right. I turned toward Grandpa and gently took his arm. "Let's go," I said. For a moment, nobody moved. It felt as though the entire room was waiting to see what would happen next. Would Daniel stop me? Would Harold apologize? Would someone somehow fix the damage that had been done? But real life doesn't work like movies. Some mistakes can't be undone with a speech. Some wounds don't heal instantly because someone finally realizes they were wrong. The truth was that by the time Harold humiliated me publicly, the marriage was already broken. His speech had simply exposed what had been hidden for years. As Grandpa and I walked toward the exit, I heard Daniel call my name one last time. I stopped briefly but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," he said. The words echoed through the room. For years I had wanted to hear them. I had imagined how much better everything would feel if he finally acknowledged the pain his silence had caused. Yet standing there I felt almost nothing. Not because the apology wasn't sincere, but because it had arrived far too late. "I believe you are," I said quietly. "But being sorry doesn't change what happened." Then I continued walking. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped outside. For several moments neither Grandpa nor I spoke. The city lights stretched across the distance while traffic moved quietly beyond the parking lot. Finally, Grandpa smiled. "You know," he said, "when you were 10 years old, you used to tell people that nobody could make you feel small unless you allowed them to." I laughed softly. "I haven't thought about that in years." He nodded. "Maybe it's time you remembered." Those simple words stayed with me. 3 months later, the divorce papers were finalized. Daniel tried repeatedly to save the marriage. He called, he wrote letters, he asked mutual friends to speak with me. For the first few weeks, I almost felt guilty. Then I reminded myself that he had been given countless opportunities to stand beside me when it mattered. He simply chose not to take them. Harold's reputation suffered significantly after the anniversary incident. Several business relationships cooled. Word spread quickly through social circles. People tend to overlook arrogance until they witness it publicly. Once they do, it's much harder to ignore. My mother-in-law spent months attempting to contact me, insisting that the family could heal if everyone made an effort. The irony was almost laughable. For 5 years, I had been the only one making an effort. A year later, my life looked completely different. I had expanded my consulting business, purchased my own home, and built friendships with people who respected me without conditions. More importantly, I had rediscovered parts of myself that had slowly disappeared during my marriage. The constant anxiety was gone. The need for approval was gone. The fear of family gatherings was gone. One afternoon, while having lunch with Grandpa, he asked whether I regretted leaving. I thought about the question carefully before answering. "No," I said. "I regret staying as long as I did." He smiled proudly. Looking back now, I realized something important. The most powerful moment of that night wasn't when everyone learned who my grandfather was. It wasn't Harold's embarrassment. It wasn't Daniel's apology. The most important moment happened when I finally understood my own value. For years, I believed I needed other people to recognize my worth before I could believe it myself. I was wrong. The truth is that self-respect begins the moment you stop allowing others to decide who you are. Harold thought exposing me would make me feel small. Instead, he exposed something much bigger. He exposed the fact that I had spent years accepting treatment I never deserved, and the moment I stopped accepting it, everything changed. The last time I ever saw Daniel was nearly 2 years later. We crossed paths at a charity event. He looked older, quieter, and far more humble than the man I once knew. We spoke briefly. There was no anger between us anymore, no resentment, just distance. As we said goodbye, he looked at me and said something I will never forget. "The biggest mistake I ever made wasn't listening to my parents," he admitted. "It was expecting you to keep enduring it." I nodded politely and walked away. This time, neither of us looked back.